Good evening, everyone, and good morning and good afternoon to all the Christians, the Jews, the Muslims, the atheists, the agnostics, the Hindus, the Buddhists, and yes, even the Taoists who are watching this right now. I am your friendly neighborhood philosopher, David Wood. According to Muhammad Hijab, I am also the word of Allah. Now, you Christians, you Jews, you atheists out there who don't necessarily agree with Muhammad Hijab, you don't have to address me as the word of Allah. But for you Muslims who are watching, I expect to be addressed with the proper respect due to Allah's word. And so you can address me as the word of Allah or David, the word of Allah, something along those lines. Now, I am here with my friend, Anthony Rodgers, who's been studying both Christianity and Islam for a long, long time. And one of the issues that came up in the debate was Allah's body parts and whether Muslim scholars affirm that these parts that the Muslim sources refer to are to be understood as referring to literal parts or as figurative in some way. But before we get into the issue, while everyone out there, me included, sends out a message to all your friends on Facebook and Twitter saying that we are live right now, while I do that, and while everyone else does that, Anthony, why don't you give us a little background about you and about how you became interested in Islam? Because if you're like me, there are lots of things you could be studying right now. Lots of things appeal to your interest, and yet you spend a lot of time dealing with Islam. Why don't you go ahead and break that down for us?
Yeah, so actually our experiences, our past, are very similar. Both of us had, let's just say, unsavory dealings in our past. As a non-Christian, I grew up in Southern California, ran with gangs, and eventually was incarcerated. And it was there that I heard the gospel from a Christian evangelist, and quickly recognized that as my only hope of escaping the wrath of God. So I put my trust in Christ, and because I was converted in that context, I was surrounded by people that were purveying a number of different messages. And I quickly discovered that my excitement in telling people about how their sins could be forgiven wasn't met with equal enthusiasm. The people I was speaking with were violently opposed in some cases to the message of the cross. And so this just served as a catalyst for me to really learn what the Bible teaches, how to defend it, as well as what other groups were teaching and how to respond to them. One of the groups that I encountered a lot in the prison was Muslims, and I quickly found that in the case of a lot of them, Islam was just an excuse to basically pacify their conscience, get a little religious, while at the same time still justifying the kind of hatred and violence they still had towards the man, towards Christians, towards anybody they wanted to hate. And of course, I'm not saying there weren't Christians that weren't faking it, but Christianity didn't give them that same sort of justification for perpetuating the same sinful lifestyle they had while pretending to be religious. So, anyways, when I was released a few years later, back in 1995, I continued to read and study and interact with all manner of non-Christian groups. And one day, when I was on a university campus preaching the gospel, I ran into a Muslim who was just like every other Muslim that I had encountered. At one point in the conversation, he threw down his backpack, was taking off his watch. In other words, he wanted to fight with me. And I kept proclaiming Christ to him, and he eventually picked up his stuff and walked away. But after that, I went home and I wrote about it, I blogged about it, and Sam Shamoun at Answering Islam saw the article. And he asked if they could put it on Answering Islam, and I said sure. And then Jochen Cates, the owner of Answering Islam, contacted me shortly after that and asked if I would continue to write for Answering Islam, and I did. And then that's how I met you.
Yeah, I eventually said, hey, why don't you start writing material on the blog, because you were putting out good material there.
Yeah. So
well, that was a long time ago. Why'd you stick with it here?
Well, I realized that Islam was Muslims say it's the fastest growing religion, and of course that's overblown. And of course it doesn't prove anything about its merits.
Well, it's primarily due to high birth rates in Muslim countries.
Right. Yeah. Right. And of course gangrene spreads quickly. That doesn't make it a good thing, right? Mm-hmm. So, but I realized it was certainly a formidable opponent of Christianity. Islam is found in many places in the world, and every time they reach a sizable number, they quickly become a threat to everyone around them. And so I realized that it was a important religion to focus on. And it's not that I only deal with Muslims. It's just that's the group of people that I do spend the most time on, and it's perhaps the one that's most public, right? The rest of the stuff I do is more behind the scenes or out on the streets in town or something like that. Mm-hmm. But
yeah, the reason I bring this up about why you would stick with dealing with Islam for a number of years is because I see a lot of people start to deal with Islam and then a year later don't ever want to touch it again. And it's not because they encountered some brilliant arguments from Muslim apologists. It's because as soon as you start to criticize Islam, you start getting endless abuse heaped upon you.
Even in debate.
Yeah. And not only from Muslims, from non-Muslims as well, right? So you'll deal with Muslims who, you're only criticizing Islam because you hate Muslims and you want to genocide against Muslims and you're a racist and things like that. But you'll hear the exact same thing from non-Muslims. Oh, the only reason you're criticizing this position, it can't be because you actually have a problem with Muhammad having sex with a 9-year-old girl. It can't be because you actually have a problem with these kinds of things. It can't be because you actually have a problem with jihad or something like that, or terrorism in the name of Allah. It can't be that. You must just hate brown people or something like that. Even if all your friends are brown, it doesn't matter. You must just be doing this out of hatred. And there's a reason that that's so common among people who respond to critics of Islam or respond to criticism of Islam. And the reason is that works with a lot of people, right? Most people generally want to feel good during the day. They want to feel good about what they're doing and stuff. If you start doing something and everyone around you starts calling you racist, bigot, hate monger, and so on, even if you believe in what you're doing and that's all complete nonsense, that has an effect on a lot of people. And so what's cool is it tends to be, not always, but it tends to be guys like us, right? Sort of rough pasts, stuff like that. We've already been abused in every possible way, right? We've been through horrible times. We've been through the criminal justice system. We've been in prison. We've been through all these things. And so someone calling us names is like it's not a big deal. So we can take that kind of thing. And so, we can keep dealing with it. All right. Well, we are going to jump into the topic now. Anthony, why don't you give us a quick overview without getting into details so far? By the way, everyone, I think we're going to have to break this down into at least 2 episodes because there are 2 main issues. One is what the Muslim sources say, about Allah and Allah's parts. And 2, how Muslim scholars interpret or understand these claims. And in the debate, I'll go ahead and play a clip here in a moment. But Anthony, why don't you just give us an overview of the issue for people who have never seen this before. They haven't watched our videos. They're hearing this for the first time. What's the kind of issue that we find in the Muslim sources that would be surprising to a lot of people?
Yeah, well, many people think that Muslims believe the same thing about God that Christians and Jews do. And the differences between Muslims and Christians is that Christians believe in the Trinity. They believe that the second person of the Trinity became incarnate. But otherwise, our doctrines are very similar. The fact is, though, that Islam is pagan to the core, and shouldn't be surprising that when we really look at what Muhammad taught, what you find not only in the Quran but in the Sunnah, that Muhammad taught the same sort of thing about his deity that would have been held by every pagan at the time, namely that he was an embodied being, that he had a body, he had body parts, he had bodily passions and so forth, even if those didn't have a way of finding an outlet, right, in certain cases, which we'll get to. So now, and this is problematic in a number of ways. Number one, you can't have God being the creator of all space, matter, and time if he is a being with body or parts, if he's a spatiotemporal being and so forth. A spatiotemporal being requires the world of space and time, or the universe of space and time, in which to exist. So you can't have a being that is a spatiotemporal being existing prior to the space-time universe. There are other problems as well, but Muslims also, and this feeds into it as well, Muslims criticize the Christian doctrine of the incarnation. They misrepresented his belief in a man God, as if we believe that Jesus was merely a man and we've deified him. But our position is really that Jesus is the eternal God. He hasn't always been a man. And even in becoming a man, his deity did not change into humanity. His deity remained what it is: eternal, infinite, unchangeable, spiritual, and so forth. The humanity of Christ has been personally united to him, but it's not his divine nature. And so Muslims misdirect criticism at Christianity as saying we believe in a man God, when the truth is actually on the other foot, right? It's Muslims who believe in a being that essentially is a man-like being, whether they like that or not.
And probably the main reason this is crucial is because this is something that comes up in a lot of different ways if we're dealing with Islamic apologetics, namely. Muslims in the West who've been preaching Islam have been on the offensive for decades, right? They're criticizing Christianity. They're criticizing the positions that are held by people in the West. But people in the West, especially if you're talking about a couple decades ago, rarely know much about Islam, right? So this has allowed Muslims to make all kinds of claims like, hey, you support women's rights? Well, you want to become a Muslim because Muhammad was the champion of women's rights. Well, if people in where you're saying that don't know anything about Islam, you get away with that. You get away with spouting that nonsense. And there are people who will convert based on that completely ridiculous claim. Or, hey, you guys like science in the West, right? You really love science? Well, did you know that Muhammad was a champion of science and that Islam invented science and that the Quran is filled with miraculous scientific insights that couldn't have been known by Muhammad, and so they must come from God? And if people don't know anything about what's in the Muslim sources, you'll have some people who are critical and want to, I would have to look into that for myself. But some people will just trust the claim. They'll hear the claim and trust the claim. So you have Muslims using arguments in support of Islam that have no actual grounding. But since no one knows any better, since no one knows what's in the Muslim sources, people are in no position to challenge it. And so one of the things we have to do now that we have open access to the Muslim sources is start challenging those claims. But there's also the issue of Muslims attacking or criticizing other ideologies, such as Christianity, on an inconsistent basis, or using objections that don't even really apply to Christianity. It's a mischaracterization or misrepresentation of Christianity, but at the same time, they actually do apply to Islam, right? So this is just an amazing thing that you have Muslim apologists attacking Christianity for bad reasons, when if they took their argument seriously and knew what their sources said, they'd realize that that objection actually does apply to Islam. Now, Anthony briefly touched on the Christian concept, but I want to raise a question just because this has come up multiple times. This comes from one of my supporters on Patreon. After you posted a video, I guess about 2 months ago, on a verse that we're going to be looking at here in a moment about everything perishing except Allah's face, and you talked about Allah's parts. He raised an obvious objection that came up, and lots of people brought up the same objection. But he writes on Patreon, I just watched the video about Allah's face being the only thing left in the end, and quite frankly, I have a problem with it that you may be able to solve for me. So the argument here is the Quran says that everything will perish except Allah's face. Now, it would be one thing if you interpreted Allah's face as being, all of Allah or something like that. But if the Quran actually and the Muslim sources mean that Allah has different parts and only his face perishes, well, you got a problem there, because now different parts of Allah have different attributes. Some are perishable and some are imperishable. So he raises the objection here. While I support your efforts to show how strange Islam is in so many ways, this video doesn't seem to reach your usual level. Haha, he's talking about my level, Anthony. Your argument isn't on my level. It could be argued that the same is the case regarding the way the Bible describes God. For example, it says in Isaiah 53, "To whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed?" Now, we don't say that this means that God actually has a real arm here. So he goes on to say, but does this mean that the Lord has an arm? Probably not. It's more likely that it is a picture of God reaching out to us and revealing his true nature. Couldn't the same be said for the verses in the Quran? So couldn't the Muslim sources just be saying that, using kind of anthropomorphic language like we find in the Bible? In other words, are we being inconsistent here, applying one standard to the Quran? Because above all else, we want to be consistent here. We demand consistency from Muslims, so obviously we need to be consistent. Are we going to the Quran, applying one standard? Hey, if it says Allah has eyes or Allah has a shin or something like that, then we're going to interpret that literally. But when we go to the Bible, we're not going to interpret God's arm literally. What do you got to say?
Yeah, so let me say something quickly about the example that he raised. It's actually a great one in a number of ways. The arm of the Lord is a phrase that may at first appear to be used in an idiomatic way in various places in the Old Testament, and it is, but there's more going on with the use of that term than many people at first realize. As you move through Scripture, you begin to see that the arm of the Lord is more and more personified until you get to the prophet Isaiah, where it ends up looking like a full-blown person. And that person is specifically identified as the coming Messiah. So it doesn't refer to a literal arm, but it doesn't simply refer to our ordinary sense of a figure of speech. Let me just give you a couple of passages on that really quick. In Isaiah 51, verse 9, it says, "Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord." So here the arm of the Lord is being called upon. "Awake as in the days of old, the generations of long ago. Was it not you," notice the personal pronoun, "you who cut Rahab in pieces, who pierced the dragon?" In other words, Rahab is most people don't know this, but it's a Hebrew way of referring to Egypt. And it's celebrating the redemption from Egypt here, but it's attributing the redemption to the Lord's arm. And what Isaiah is doing is calling upon the arm of the Lord to come and do now what he had done for Israel in the past. And I won't read all the passages on this, but when you get to Isaiah 53, if you go to Isaiah 52, starting in verse 13, notice who's being spoken of here. It says in verse 13, "Behold, my servant will prosper. He will be high and lifted up and greatly exalted, just as many were astonished at you, my people. So his appearance was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. Thus he will sprinkle many nations. Kings will shut their mouths on account of him. For what had not been told them they'll see, and what they had not heard they'll understand." So it's talking about the Lord's servant who's going to suffer great cruelty and great disfigurement. But notice what it goes on to say immediately in the next chapter. "Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a tender shoot and like a root out of parched ground." In other words, the arm of the Lord is a title of the coming Messiah who is going to suffer for the sins of God's people. So the Old Testament specifically defines for us what arm of the Lord refers to. It's the Messiah. Now, we can do that with any number of things in the Old Testament and show that the Bible defines them, and it's not to be understood as a literal body part. Now, I'm sensitive to this. In fact, I think we did a show on this a long time ago on ABN where I brought up early on, I said, when I first started reading the Islamic sources, I came to it as a Christian expecting to find things similar to what I believe is a Christian. Muhammad was influenced by Jews and Christians. And when I initially read certain things in the Quran, I thought, okay, that's just figurative, right? Allah created the heavens with his hands. The Bible uses language like that. And so I was already inclined to believe that. The problem was that as I continued to read the Islamic sources, I was being forced more and more into the position of saying, wait a minute, these aren't figures of speech. These are to be understood literally. And the evidence just continued to mount. It continued to accumulate. And then as I started, moving beyond the Islamic sources and I started reading Muslim scholars, I realized, wait a minute, Muslims were saying the same thing. In fact, the earliest Muslims, the traditionalist school of Islam, was thoroughly, for interpreting these things literally.
Let's back up very quickly because we just want to make sure everyone understood the response to the particular question. You're saying that when the Bible refers to the arm of the Lord or talks about God's eyes, seeing things, you're pointing out that we don't interpret these literally because within the context, it's clear what's being said here. It's clear what's being said. And so the intention of the writers of Scripture isn't to describe an actual physical arm of God going out, but you're saying that when we go to the Muslim sources, even as Christians who understand that ancient writers would use terms like this, talking about God's eyes or God's hand or God's arm, even when we go to the Muslim sources with that understanding and expect to find the same thing, yes, the Muslim sources are talking about Allah's face and hands and legs and so on, and we expect these things also to not have a literal meaning. You're saying that it's the texts themselves that show, no, you do need to interpret these as literal, and that Muslim scholars down through history, not of course all scholars, there are plenty of scholars who interpret these things metaphorically, but the scholars who seem to be taking these passages seriously, right, not trying to avoid the obvious implications, they're interpreting them the same way you're interpreting them. Namely, they're interpreting them as literal claims about God's face, God's form, God's hands, and so on. And so in response to charges of inconsistency that we're applying two different methods, we would say yes, if it were just the case that both books or both sets of sources talked about God having parts, yes, it would be inconsistent if we applied one standard to one and a different standard to the other, but it's not what we're doing at all. The texts are describing God's parts in very, very different ways, and one of these collections of texts are describing God's parts in a way that it seems it can only be understood literally, and Muslim scholars are agreeing with us.
Yes. And let me point out something about the fact that some Muslim scholars don't take these things literally. In the history of Islam, and this is where you mentioned that Muslims have been on the offense and Muslims have been doing certain things, and now Christians need to know how to return the favor, how to, first of all, answer those objections to Christianity, but also advance the argument against Islam. But one of the things they know how to do is bring up things about the development of doctrine in Christian history that Christians have not become equally adept at when it comes to conversing with Muslims about Islam. The fact is that Islam has had its own history of doctrinal development. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is the earliest Muslims, and we'll talk more about this on the next show on this issue, but the earliest Muslims took these things literally. And what's really interesting is Muslims can't simply write these men off for a number of reasons. I'll give you just one example. One person in the history of Islam who's widely recognized as teaching that Allah literally has hands and face and so forth was Ahmed bin Hanbal. Now, Ahmed bin Hanbal is famous for quite a number of reasons. In the first place, he has an incredibly large collection of hadiths. The hadiths that were collected are not limited to the ones that we find in the 6 standard collections. But Ahmed bin Hanbal had a very large collection of hadiths, and they're not simply unaccepted by Muslims simply because they're not in Bukhari or Muslim. The same standards of hadith criticism are to be applied to those that are applied to Bukhari and Muslims hadiths, for example, and determined, for their strength or weakness. But But Ahmed bin Hanbal was an early traditionist Muslim. He held to the Quran and Sunnah. But at his time, what was coming into ascendancy was a new position among Muslims that had been influenced by reading the Greek philosophers. Right? This group of Muslims came to be called the Mu'tazili, and the Mu'tazili said that the Quranic statements about Allah's attributes have to be subordinated to what we can know philosophically. So in other words, if we know something philosophically has to be the case, and the Quran says something else, well, those can't be taken literally. And one of the champion of the Islamic cause at the time who opposed them was Ahmed bin Hanbal. Now, while most people don't know about this, here's one thing most people will know about Ahmed bin Hanbal. He was the one who championed over against the Mu'tazili the view that the Quran is eternal, right? That's a position all Muslims hold, and it was Ahmed bin Hanbal. The Mu'tazili opposed it because they rejected the notion that Allah's attributes are to be taken literally, and they also rejected the idea that Allah's attributes are distinguishable from his essence. Now, that's a complicated issue, but the point is that Ahmed bin Hanbal, as part of his overall argument for the eternality of the Quran, was also arguing for taking Allah's attributes literally. And so it's the original position of Muslims that Allah has these features. It's not a later position, and it can't be written off as heretical because it was championed by their own champion of orthodoxy in Islamic history.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's go ahead and play the video clip. This is only the second video clip I've played using this program, so let me try this real quick again. And so this is how the issue came up in the debate, and Muhammad Hijab is asking for more information on this. He doesn't seem to be familiar with this issue in Islamic history. So, all right.
Second, according to the Quran, most of Allah's parts will die. The Quran and the Hadith refer to Allah's face, his hands, two right hands, in fact, fingers, waist, shin, feet, and so on. Now, there's a tendency to interpret scriptural statements about God's bodily parts figuratively. If we say God's eyes see everything, no one thinks we're saying that God has eyeballs. But there are Muslim scholars themselves are the ones who are arguing that descriptions of Allah's face and hands and feet and so on have to be interpreted literally, not simply anthropomorphically.
10 minutes left.
So Allah has a literal face, literal hands, and so on. And yet, we read in the Quran, Surah 28, verse 88, everything will perish except Allah's face. Which means, if you are taking these parts literally, and the only thing that survives is Allah's face, then Allah's face has different attributes from the rest of his parts, perishable versus imperishable.
Allah has parts. He says Muslim scholars say we should take this literally. Which Muslim scholars? Which Muslim scholars? He says, كُلُّ شَيْءٍ هَالِكْ إِلَّا وَجْهَ. In Surah Al-Qasas, chapter 20 of the Quran, means everything is destroyed except for his face. And this means that Allah, all his body parts will be destroyed. He has body parts in these things. First of all, the word kull in Arabic doesn't necessarily mean all. As-Subki wrote a book, Al-Kull wa ma tadul. And he said, and he shows with examples, that the word kull doesn't mean all. I'll give you an example. In chapter 46 of the Quran, Surah Al-Ahqaf, تُدَمِّرُ كُلُّ شَيْءٍ بِإِذْنِ رَبِّهَا فَأَصْبَحُوا لَا يُرَى إِلَّا مَسَاكِنَهُمْ. That the wind destroyed everything, كُلُّ شَيْء, the same words here in Surah Al-Qasas, everything was destroyed except for their houses. If it meant every single thing, it wouldn't have been, their houses would not be there. So the word kull doesn't mean that in Arabic language. Once again, it's a problem with language.
All right, now there are lots of things we could say there. We could focus on the issue of Allah's face perishing. Now he focused on the kulu part, which is in that verse, everything perishes except Allah's face. But there are other places in the Quran where it can't mean everything, right? So if Allah says that the wind destroyed everything and yet houses were still standing, then it doesn't mean everything, right? Now, I would be of the position that it's going to depend on context of what's being meant here, right? Like if I say, oh man, this came in and destroyed everything. I don't mean everything that exists, right? I don't mean God was destroyed. I don't mean the universe was destroyed. I don't mean that. But when the Quran is saying everything perishes except Allah's face, or every soul shall taste death, it's clear that any exceptions to this rule are being mentioned here. So it's not just saying everything in some sort of general sense to mean, hey, a lot of stuff was destroyed or something like that. It's clear in the context that something bigger is being meant here. But with that said, that's not the reason I was bringing that up. I'll probably discuss in a different video why I was mentioning that, because the real reason is when Muslims are talking about references to the Father being God or being the only God, and they say, aha, the Father is the only God. They say, aha, but this excludes Jesus and the Holy Spirit. Therefore, the Trinity is false. But if the Quran is saying everything will perish except Allah's face, and yet it can mean that more than Allah's face is going to be around later, then they can't use those kinds of interpretations. In other words, if God is the only God, this wouldn't, if the Father is the only God, this wouldn't exclude the Son and the Holy Spirit. So basically, I'm getting them to acknowledge, which he did, and this is why it's relevant. He acknowledged that even if it says everything except Allah's face will perish, this doesn't mean that everything except Allah's face is going to perish. So it doesn't actually mean what the text says. So notice, that's his method of interpretation. So now we get to bring this up in response to some of the passages that they would bring up. But that's kind of a side issue. The more important issue for purposes of our discussion right now is Muhammad Hijab really didn't understand that there are Muslim scholars who interpret these passages literally. And when he said, which Muslim scholars? The crowd laughed like they don't get this either, right? That's what it sounded like. Muhammad Hijab has no clue what we're talking about when we say that Muslim scholars interpret Allah's face, form, hands, feet literally. He doesn't know that, and the crowd didn't know it either. They had no clue that there are passages in the Muslim sources which only make sense if they're talking about something, a literal body part of Allah. But two, that this is a long tradition going back to the earliest stages of Islam, that Allah actually has literal parts. So they don't know that. Notice that means two things. One, even Muslim apologists don't know this. And two, your average Muslim certainly doesn't know this. And so this is information that Christians and other non-Muslims are going to need to learn. This is information we're going to need to learn so that we can share that. So we can share that information with them. Because guess what? They're not going to hear it from their leaders who want them to be mocking Christianity because Jesus in his incarnate state had a body, right? They want to be able to continue mocking Christianity for certain things. And so they don't want the actual scholars who know this. They don't want your average Muslim in the street to be aware of the fact that Allah has a body. They don't want them to know that. They want them to have a confidence that Islam doesn't teach these things. And so we're going to have to be the ones who teach them what's in the Muslim sources. And I say this is a sad situation because it seems like 90% of the time when Muslims are learning anything about Islam, they're learning it from non-Muslims because we're the only ones who are going to tell them this. So we're at least going to have two parts on this, depending on how time goes. We're at least going to discuss what the Muslim sources say in this. And we might need to do three because we're already over half an hour into this. So we might need to do two parts. This part and then one more part going through the Muslim sources on Allah's parts, and then a separate issue where we'll actually play video clips from Muslim scholars where they tell you what they believe about Allah's parts, and texts from some of Islam's most trusted scholars over the centuries who are saying exactly what I said in that debate and Muslims laughed at, right? This is what I find amazing, and I mentioned it several times in the debate. I would be bringing up something that's straight out of the Muslim sources or straight out of Islamic history, and the Muslim crowds would be laughing. I would be quoting their prophet, and they would be laughing. They think it's so silly. And that's why it's important to learn this material. Muslims themselves think this is silly. They just don't know it. So we got to bring this up to them. All right, Anthony. So what part of Allah do you want to talk about first? Hey, whoa. You're silenced. Did you silence yourself?
Yeah, I silenced myself.
Ah.
All right.
I wish lots of people would do that more often, but not you.
All right, pick a part. So I'm gonna start off by talking about the form of Allah, the fact that He actually has a shape. Now, I don't remember which video it was on the YouTube page, but I do have a video where I actually have Muslim scholars talking about Allah's form, including Zakir Naik and a number of other Muslims. But here, this is a hadith. Sorry about that noise. Mm-hmm. This is a hadith found in Jamiat Tirmidhi, volume 6, number 3234. And here's what it says. It's Ibn Abbas narrated. So this is Muhammad's cousin, and his narrations are treated like gold among Muslims.
Doesn't get much better than him.
Right. Ibn Abbas narrated that the Prophet said, so it's referring to Muhammad. This is what Muhammad said. My Lord, blessed is He and Most High, came to me in the best of forms. He said to me, O Muhammad, and I said, Here I am, O my Lord, I'm at your service. He said, what is it that the most exalted group busy themselves with? So he's referring here to the angels. What do the angels do? What are they busy about? Then Muhammad says in response, Lord, I do not know. So He, Allah, placed His palm between my shoulders until I felt its coolness between my breasts. So then I knew what was in between the east and the west. Now, notice two things here. First, Muhammad refers to Allah's form, and second, he refers to Allah's palm. Now, I'm not going to emphasize Allah's palm here, other than to observe that the palm necessarily has to be understood literally, and because a lot of Muslims will like to say, well, we say that He has these parts, but they don't. We don't say how. We don't go any further than that. We just leave that as sort of a mystery. But in other words, you can't say that it has certain dimensions, limitations, and so forth. But notice that Muhammad speaks of Allah's palm fitting between his two shoulder blades. Okay, and then he also speaks of feeling it. He says he feels the coolness of it even in his chest. So here you have two things about Allah describing something regarding His physical nature, His anatomy.
Mm-hmm. Now, hang on, because this would raise this would be a good opportunity to clarify the difference between the Christian understanding of God and the Islamic understanding of God. Notice if you feel Allah's palm on your back, how do you interpret that figuratively, right? It is a physical feeling of a part of Allah on you, right? If you were to say Allah's palm created the universe, of course we could understand that metaphorically. Of course we wouldn't have to say, oh yes, this is referring to a physical palm. If you say Allah's fist punched me in my face and I got knocked over, you're clearly saying, I'm interpreting this literally, right? It is a literal fist that hit me and knocked me over. Well, likewise, if Allah's palm is on Muhammad, that must be literal. That has to be. That's not some sort of figure of speech there. Now, Anthony, just again, so we can understand the difference between Islam and Christianity on this point, that wouldn't be a problem if, let's say, Abraham had said that God showed up and he put his palm on my back. We wouldn't have any problem with that. So why would we not have a problem with it? And yet it would be a problem. It is a problem for Muslims.
Right. So we say that God is infinite, eternal, unchangeable. God is a spirit. He existed outside the space-time universe. He created it. But He didn't create a world that He was incapable of entering into, and He didn't create a creature that He was incapable of having personal interactions with. as Christians, we believe that God has the ability to stoop or condescend and assume a human form and appearance and converse with men, which is what he did with Abraham in Genesis 18, or other individuals throughout the Old Testament, Jacob even in Genesis 32. So that's not a problem for Christians. We have a concept of God being able to condescend. In fact, we even believe that God could and did become incarnate. So that's not a problem for Christian theology. The only thing that we insist upon is that this is not a description of God and his essential or eternal nature, right? But Islam does not have these categories. One of the fundamental objections of Muslims to the incarnation is this kind of thing is impossible for Allah. Allah can't stoop. He can't humble himself. He can't become incarnate. He can't appear in human form. All of these things are precluded, right? Because Allah is just too above that, right? And so when we see descriptions like this of Allah, these can't be descriptions of Allah condescending because Allah is above that. They have to be a description of what Allah is actually like in his eternal nature, right? These aren't assumed forms. These are this is eternal.
And, go ahead.
Yeah, let me give another hadith just to further reinforce this. This is from Sahih Muslim, book 40. Number 6809. This is from Abu Huraira, who narrated numerous trustworthy reports. Allah's messenger, Muhammad, said, Allah, the exalted and glorious, created Adam in his own form with his own length of 60 cubits. Now, pay close attention to the pronouns here. The pronouns here all refer to Allah. Okay? It says, Allah created Adam in his own form with his own length of 60 cubits. This is not only saying that Adam had a form, that Adam was 60 cubits, which is 90 feet tall, by the way. It's specifically saying that Adam's form, Adam's height, was equivalent to the form and height of Allah. So Allah, according to Sahih Muslim, has a form and a height of 90 cubits.
And by the way, here's another one that wouldn't make any sense if you're not interpreting this literally, right? It doesn't make sense to say that Allah is metaphorically 90 feet tall, and so he made Adam in the same, of the same height that he is. It wouldn't make any sense, right? If you're using a metaphor, you're using a figure of speech that's meant to draw your attention to something else. So what would this be saying? What in the name of common sense would this be talking about here? And by the way, everyone, this is important. It's very what it means in Judaism and Christianity to be created in the image of God, very different from what it means in Islam to be created in the image of God. In Islam, it's like you're created in the same shape, right? You're kind of a photocopy, not what we mean in Christianity. But go ahead, Anthony.
Yeah, and it's quite possible that Muhammad, as a pagan, hearing Jews and Christians recite passages of the Bible, interpreted them through pagan lenses and came away with that understanding. But I have to get in here one of my favorite hadiths, and this one is not well known, but it's found in Al-Tabari's history. This is from Volume 1, page 262, a general introduction from creation to the flood. But now remember, here's the background. Remember that Allah, according to Sahih Muslim, created Adam according to his form and with his height. So Adam, in a sense, is a duplicate of Allah, right? He bears Allah's likeness, his literal form and height. Okay, well, according to this hadith, narrated by numerous companions of Muhammad, it said, Allah said to the angels, I am creating a human being from clay. When I have fashioned him and blown some of my spirit into him, fall down in prostration to him. Now, you'll recognize that as something the Quran also says, that the angels were to prostrate before Adam. But here, this is just Allah announcing at some point prior to the event that he's going to create Adam, and the angels are going to be obligated to bow down to him. Well, then it goes on. It says, Allah created him with his own hands. Okay, notice it says his own hands. That'll be important later. But it says, lest Iblis become overbearing toward Adam. Okay, now follow along with this because people like to just read over this stuff too casually. It specifically said Allah is going to create him with his own hands so that Satan will not be overbearing toward him. So Allah creating Adam with his own hands is a way of setting Adam above everything else. Mm-hmm. Okay? And this is an allusion to Surah 38:75, where Allah upbraids Satan for not bowing down to Adam, even though he created Adam with his own two hands. It doesn't just say Allah's hands, it says his own hands. And it doesn't just say his own hands, it says his own two hands. Mm-hmm. And so the Quran is being very specific in Surah 38:75 and in this hadith. But let me read the rest of it, because this is where it gets really interesting. It says, Allah created Adam with his own hands, so that Iblis would not be overbearing toward him, and so that Allah could say to Iblis, you're overbearing towards something that I created with my own two hands, which I myself was not too haughty to make. So God created, so now, but don't miss though, this is Allah giving his reasoning of why he's going to do it this way. He hasn't told Satan yet what he's doing, right? A certain company of angels knows that he's going to create a man with his own hands, but Satan doesn't yet know what's going on. So it goes on and it says, so God created Adam as a human being. He was a body of clay for 40 years, the extent of Friday. So it's saying that he first creates Adam as basically a lifeless statue before he breathes life into him. And so this statue is standing there for 40 years. It says, when the angels passed by him, they were frightened by what they saw. So they're frightened by this statue. Okay? And then it goes on, the angel that was most frightened was Iblis, Satan. He would pass by him, kick him, and thus make the body produce a sound as potter's clay does. Then he would say, what were you created for? He entered his mouth and left through his posterior. So Satan goes into the statue's mouth and then leaves out its rump, right out its backside. But now listen to why he does this. Satan's conducting an investigation, okay? It says, then Satan went back to the angels and he said, don't be afraid of that one, for your Lord is solid. That one is hollow. Okay? When I am given authority over him, I'll ruin him. So you see the logic of what's going on here. Allah creates a statue that looks just like him. Okay? 90 feet tall, has his appearance and so forth. When the angels see it, they're afraid, including Satan. In other words, they think it's Allah. And Satan goes over and conducts a test. He kicks it. He goes in through its mouth and out through its rear, and comes back to the other angels and says, hey guys, don't worry, that's not Allah. That thing's hollow, but your Lord is solid. Hey, mm-hmm. So the Islamic sources are not. I mean, you can't get figures of speech out of this.
Yeah.
This is quite literal, and it's crudely anthropomorphic. In fact, I mean, it's not. There's just no ifs, ands, or buts about it.
I laughed because you said butts. Okay, you were talking. You were saying cruelly anthropomorphic, and then talking about going out to the posterior, and then you said if, ands, or buts. So I don't know if that was intentional or not, but it sounds like something you would intend. Now, guys, I don't know if you didn't catch all that, go back and watch that, because think about this, right? Normally, as Christians and Muslims today who aren't thinking this information through, if they hear that Allah created with his hands, or if we hear that God created with his hands, as Christians, we could interpret that one of two ways. One, that God actually took on a form and then did something physically. We believe God can do that. God can appear. God can condescend and appear, as Anthony pointed out. So we would have one of two ways of interpreting this. Your average Muslim, if he heard that Allah created with his hands, would interpret this figuratively, as, Allah just spoke something into existence, but since Allah's doing it with his power or something like that, it talks about Allah doing it with his hands. But if we're reading that Allah created Adam with his hands to set him apart from everything else, well, that's showing that he's creating in a completely different way from which he created everything else. So Allah created everything through his power and so on. If he's creating man in a different way, where he's actually using his hands to set man apart, to make an example out of him for others, you can only understand this. You can only understand this literally, that he is literally creating with his hands. And so here we find passage after passage after passage where we can only understand what the Muslim sources are saying if we are are understanding these passages literally, to refer to Allah's literal parts. Now, Anthony, you can. We've got about 10 more minutes, so you can give one or two more examples. I did want to respond quickly to one comment here. This one always comes up, but we've got Umar Mujahid. Hadiths are not God's words, but men's words.
Oh, well.
We can just throw out the hadiths then, ladies and gentlemen. Did you catch that? I mean, my goodness, Umar, if you're Umar Mujahid, I assume that you're taking Islam seriously, right? So if you're taking Islam seriously, you have to know that you would be considered a heretic if you're saying that we don't have to take Muhammad's words in the hadiths seriously, right? Saying, oh, well, it's Muhammad speaking, it's Muhammad talking, so we don't have to listen to him because he's not Allah. Well, Allah tells you in the Quran, chapter 4, verse 65, look it up, that you have to obey all of Muhammad's decisions and can't find any disagreement with them, or you're not a real Muslim. So you need to be taking these things seriously. And by the way, if you don't want to take what Muhammad said seriously, because it's not the Quran, great, but you need to change a lot of Islamic practices, right? The Shahada. You have a kind of Shahada telling you that there's no God but Allah in the Quran, but the Shahada that Muslims actually recite, there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger, that first step in becoming a Muslim, that comes from the Hadith, which we don't have to follow, according to you. Praying 5 times a day, and what you say during your prayers, a lot of what you say during your prayers, that comes from the Hadith, which you say we don't need to pay attention to. A lot of your rituals and practices, these come from the Hadith. So if you're throwing them out, great. But again, you would be regarded as a heretic if that's your actual position. So hopefully you weren't just trying to pull a fast one on us and get us to ignore the clear things that your sources say about your God. You're trying to rescue your God from what your prophet said, right? Muhammad made all these claims about your God, and you're saying, no, don't believe those things about God. Throw those sources out. That's very interesting. All right, Anthony, you got about 8 minutes left. Do you want to give one or two more examples?
Okay,
or
yeah.
Did you want to add something to that?
2 things quickly, and along with that. Number one, if you throw out those people that gave us the hadith as unreliable, these things don't really go back to Muhammad, then you also have to throw out the Quran, because the same people that gave us the hadith gave us the Quran. They're the ones that transmitted it. But then secondly, he apparently missed the fact that I made reference to the Quran. It's not that there's any shortage of references in the Quran. It's just that the hadith go on to interpret some things for us additional to that, and they're relevant to bring up as well. But the whole discussion of this stems from what's said in Surah 38:75. In Surah 38:75, Allah comes and he's upset with Satan for not worshiping Adam. Now listen to what he says. Allah said, "O Iblis, O Satan, why did you not prostrate to the one whom I created with my own 2 hands? Were you arrogant, or were you already among the haughty?" What he's saying is that he should have bowed down to Satan, Satan should have bowed down to Adam, because Adam was special. Adam was a worthy object of prostration because he was created with Allah's own 2 hands. Now, imagine that this is just a figure of speech. Allah is just saying that Adam was created like he creates everything else, right? Everything's created with Allah's 2 hands. Well, if that's the case, then there's no special reason that stems from that for why anybody ought to prostrate to Adam rather than to everything else, right?
We should be bowing down to everything. Look at that rock. We should bow down to it. Oh, there's a pig over there. We should bow down to that pig. Following the interpretation of the Muslim here, right? Umar Mujahid. I don't believe that stuff that Anthony was saying from other Muslim sources. Well, that's just drawing attention to something that comes from the Quran itself.
Yeah. So now, along with that, since it's simply silly to reject the hadith, let me just point out one hadith that's really what Muslim hadith scholars refer to as a mutawatir hadith. A mutawatir hadith is a hadith that is so it's enumerated so many times through so many different chains of narrators that it's basically, it's as certain as they come, if you will. There's no viable way to reject this hadith without rejecting every other hadith on under the sun. So this is a mass narrated hadith. It's found several times in Bukhari, several times in Muslim, several times in Tirmidhi. I have just right here about 10, 15 statements, but it's reporting what's going to happen with people on the day of resurrection. Okay, people are going to be waiting in this massive line full of people for Allah to commence the judgment, and the day is going to drag on for so long, and they're going to be in the heat, and they're eventually going to be wanting to rush the day along, right? Let's get this over with. But they're fearful that when Allah comes, He's going to destroy them, and so they want somebody to intercede for them that they think will have special favor with Allah. And basically they run through a group of people, and each person in turn says, I'm not worthy, you came to the wrong person, go to somebody else. Until eventually you get to Muhammad, right? And then Muhammad says he's going to be the guy that can intercede with Allah. But I want you to notice what it says specifically about Adam, because their first candidate for somebody worthy to intercede with Allah is Adam. Now listen to the reason why they think he's worthy. Narrated Anas, Allah's apostle said, the believers will be assembled on the day of resurrection, and they will say, let us look for someone to intercede for us with our Lord, so that He will relieve us from this place of ours. So they will go to Adam and say, you are Adam, the father of mankind, and Allah created you with His own 2 hands, and ordered the angels to prostrate before you, and He taught you the names of all things. So please intercede for us with our Lord, so that He may relieve us. And then Adam will go on to say, well, no, I sinned against my Lord, so don't come to me. But notice they single out Adam because he was made with Allah's hands. Mm-hmm. Now, time is fleeting here, so let me just point out quickly that there are other hadiths that also mention, and this really just, I think, walls Muslims into a literal interpretation. There are various hadiths that tell us that Allah only created 3 or 4 things with His own hands directly. Right? It refers to the Garden of Eden. He planted the trees of the Garden of Eden. He created the throne, or some say the pen. He created, he wrote the Torah for Adam, and then he created Adam with his own hands. Now, when you have the hadiths, in addition to the Quran, the Quranic rationale, the hadiths that talk about Allah's hands and Adam being made in Allah's image and His form, and Allah touching Adam or Muhammad with His palm, and on it goes, and then them singling out Adam as a special object of prostration, and then the hadith saying that He only created 3 or 4 things directly with His own hands. There's no interpretation imaginable that will get you out of taking those things literally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you're absolutely correct here, and guys, I hope you were paying attention, right? Because this is important. And Anthony, don't you have like 70 pages of examples like this from the Muslim sources, something like that?
Yeah, and I'm not even through recording them all. I have 70 pages just with narrations of Allah's anatomy. And we've only touched on the fact that Allah has a form and Allah has hands. I could easily point to passages of the Quran and in the Sunnah that refer to Allah's face, His eyes, His legs, His foot, His shin, even of the fact that Muslims are expected to have a mental picture of Allah in their minds so that they'll recognize Him on the Day of Judgment. There are even passages in the Islamic sources that refer to Allah's gonads. The Islamic sources are not shy to speak of Allah and His body parts.
It's Muslims today who are shy to talk about these things because their theology has been modified over the centuries beyond what Muhammad himself and his companions laid down as authoritative Islamic theology. All right, well, we are about out of time. I think we are going to have to do at least a 3-part series. This is the first one. We want to talk about the shin and the other parts, so I think we'll do that next time. And then the third part to talk about Muslim scholars who actually agree with everything we're saying right now, that Allah's various parts have to be understood literally, that a lot of these passages make no sense unless you're talking about literal body parts of Allah. Now, we understand that there are Muslims who are going to disagree with us. They're going to disagree with us. But guess what? We'll give you that opportunity. So you have this video. This video is going to have a live comment section, so you can go ahead, raise your objections. Tell us how we are to understand Allah's hands creating Adam, that is in a way that's different from Allah creating other things. Explain to us what it means for Allah to put His hand on Muhammad's back. Explain to us the passages that Anthony brought up, and he only brought up a few of them, right? There's only a few examples you have to explain so far. There are many more that you're going to have to explain that we're going to bring up on part 2. But just explain those for us, and if you offer anything remotely resembling a good response, we'll take it into consideration. Maybe pop it up on the screen in part 2 to respond to it. So go ahead. You've got the comments section right there. We'll see everyone next time as we discuss these issues. By the way, in the comments section, I'm going to have a link to Anthony's Patreon page. If you remember, a couple months ago, we started doing shows and we ran into all sorts of technical problems. And so we shut that down temporarily. But those of you who know Anthony works multiple jobs. So I feel kind of weird asking him to appear regularly on shows to answer objections and so on, to go through Christian theology or Islamic theology. But if people can jump in there and contribute some funds to him through Patreon, then it makes more sense, right? Because now I can say, hey, Anthony, right? Hey, I'm sending people over to your Patreon. They're kicking in money. Now you have to appear. So you have to be on here with me. So if you want to see us discussing these issues, if you get a chance, go contribute $1, $2, $5, something like that. If enough people do it, it adds up. I would love to see Anthony eventually just, be doing this sort of thing full time, taking questions and objections from Muslims and responding to them. So hope to see that, and we'll talk to all of you next time right here on Act 17 Apologetics.